0701.3 Good evening, Night Wanderer, and welcome. Whether you're nestled in bed, stretching out your legs after a long day, or simply craving a calming moment of quiet reflection, I'm glad you're here with me tonight. This evening, we're setting out on a journey across centuries to meet some of the most remarkable and influential women from the medieval world. Women who defied their times, left their mark on history, and continue to inspire even now. Before we step into their stories, let's take a moment to picture the setting. The Middle Ages. Spanning from the 5th to the 15th century in Europe, it was a time of sweeping change, brutal conflict, and astonishing creativity. The Roman Empire had crumbled, and in its place rose kingdoms, cathedrals, feudal lords, and fierce crusaders. It was an age marked by spiritual devotion, disease, innovation, and a rigidly patriarchal structure that often left little room for women to wield power. Yet, against these odds, there were women who rose. Some held crowns, others quills or prayer beads, but each left behind a legacy powerful enough to echo through time. Tonight, we'll explore their lives, not as legends, but as women, clever, brave, complicated, and real. Let's begin with a woman who rose from scandal to become one of the most powerful figures in the Byzantine Empire, Empress Theodora. Born around 500 AD in the vibrant city of Constantinople, Theodora came from humble beginnings. Her father worked as a bear trainer in the hippodrome, and after his death, her mother struggled to keep the family afloat. Young Theodora began performing in the theatre, bold, provocative, and fiercely intelligent. Some would later call her a courtesan, but even in her early years, Theodora stood out for her wit, her presence, and her ability to command a room. It was this spark that caught the attention of Justinian, a rising star in the imperial court. He wasn't emperor yet, but his ambition was clear. Despite the scandal of her past, Justinian was smitten, not just by her beauty, but by her sharp intellect and fearless spirit. Against considerable opposition, he changed the law so he could marry her, and in 525 AD, they wed. Just a few years later, Justinian ascended to the throne, and Theodora, once a performer dismissed by society, became Empress of the Byzantine Empire. But Theodora was far more than a decorative consort. She was his co-ruler, his advisor, his equal. During the Nika riots of 532, a violent uprising that nearly toppled Justinian's rule, he considered fleeing the city. It was Theodora who stood firm, urging him to stay and fight. Her speech, fierce and unwavering, reportedly convinced him to hold his ground. Her resolve may have saved the empire. Beyond politics, Theodora became a tireless advocate for the vulnerable. She championed laws to protect women, especially former sex workers and abused wives. She pushed for rights that were almost unthinkable in her time: property ownership for women, increased guardianship for mothers, and the end of trafficking young girls. She founded a refuge, the Medie convent, where women could find safety and begin again. When she died in 548, she left behind a transformed empire and a legacy of compassion, strength, and visionary leadership. Our journey next takes us to a woman of faith and learning from the windswept northern coast of England, Hilda of Whitby. Born around 614 AD into the royal household of Deira, one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of early England, Hilda had noble blood but chose a spiritual path. As a teenager, she embraced Christianity and entered monastic life. In 657, she founded the monastery at Whitby, perched on the cliffs overlooking the cold North Sea. Under Hilda's guidance, Whitby became more than a place of prayer. It blossomed into a vibrant centre of education and culture. Monks and nuns studied side by side. Poets, scholars, and pilgrims gathered under her leadership. Her reputation for wisdom spread far and wide. Hilda wasn't just a spiritual guide, she was a respected political figure too. Kings and bishops sought her advice on matters of governance and faith. She played a pivotal role in one of the most important ecclesiastical gatherings of her era, the Synod of Whitby in 1664 AD. This council aimed to resolve religious disagreements between Roman and Celtic Christian practices, especially regarding the date of Easter. Hilda hosted it at her abbey, demonstrating her skill as a peacemaker and her standing in the church. She was also a patron of creativity. Under her wing, a humble cowherd named Kedmon found his voice as a poet. Legend says he was gifted with divine inspiration, and with Hilda's encouragement, created beautiful hymns that would become the earliest known examples of English Christian poetry. Hilda's impact endured long after her death in 680. Revered as a saint, her abbey remained a place of influence, and her model of monastic education would shape the future of English religious life for centuries. So far, we've met an empress who ruled with grit and grace, and an abbess who led with wisdom and wit. As we continue, we'll meet queens, warriors, mystics, and writers, each of them stepping beyond the bounds of what their time expected of women. And in doing so, they rewrote what it meant to hold power in a world that tried to deny them the pen. Su-701-3 Nirubom. Now, let's journey to the windswept hills and misty battlefields of 9th century England to meet a woman who led armies and defended kingdoms, Lady Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians. Born around 870 AD, Ethelfled was the eldest daughter of King Alfred the Great of Wessex. From an early age, she was steeped in the brutal realities of war. Viking invasions ravaged the land, and her family fought tirelessly to defend their kingdom. When she married Ethelred, Lord of the Mercians, their union wasn't just a political alliance, it was a shared mission to defend their people. After Ethelred fell ill and eventually died, Ethelflaed didn't retreat into quiet widowhood. Instead, she assumed command, something nearly unheard of for a woman in Anglo-Saxon England. But the people of Mercia supported her, and with them, she launched military campaigns that pushed back Viking forces and secured key fortresses. She wasn't just a warrior, though, she was a strategist. Under her leadership, towns were fortified, trade was strengthened, and the foundations of a unified England began to take shape. Her contemporaries called her Lady of the Mercians, and even Viking enemies respected her might. When she died in 918, her daughter briefly succeeded her, a rare instance of female succession in early English politics. Ethelflaed proved that leadership didn't always require a crown, only courage, clarity, and conviction. From battlefields to the quiet corridors of scholarship, we now travel to 12th century Germany, where a visionary mystic and healer reshaped how people viewed science, faith, and creativity. Hildegard of Bingen. Born in 1098, Hildegard experienced visions from a young age, vivid, luminous encounters she believed came from the divine. At 8, she was sent to live in a monastery, and over time she rose to become its abbess. But Hildegard was no cloistered recluse. Her intellect, curiosity, and creativity were boundless. She wrote extensively on medicine, botany, theology, music, and cosmology. Her compositions, haunting and ethereal, are still performed today. In her treatises, she explored the healing power of plants, the balance of the body, and the interconnectedness of creation, all from a deeply spiritual, yet surprisingly scientific perspective. Her most famous visions were compiled into illustrated manuscripts, blending rich symbolism with intricate theology. She corresponded with emperors, popes, and archbishops, advising them with a mix of spiritual insight and pragmatic counsel. In a time when most women were silenced, Hildegard wrote, and the world listened. Next, we travel to France to meet a woman whose pen sliced through centuries of misogyny and laid the groundwork for feminist thought, Christine de Pizan. Born in Venice in 1364 but raised in the French court, Christine was highly educated thanks to her father, a court astrologer, but her life took a sharp turn when her husband died young, leaving her with 3 children and no financial security. Instead of remarrying, Christine picked up her quill. She became one of the first professional female writers in Europe. Her early poems were personal and mournful, but she soon began writing political commentary, biographies, and philosophical texts. Her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, imagined an allegorical city built by and for women, defended against slander by the intellectual strength and moral virtue of its inhabitants. In its pages, she defended women against centuries of sexist thought, challenging the works of men who claimed that women were inherently inferior. She didn't just respond, she dismantled, point by point, line by line. Christine's writing gained her patrons among royalty and nobles. She debated publicly with male scholars and inserted herself into political conversations at a time when women were expected to remain silent and obedient. Through literature, she built a refuge, a place where women could think, speak, and be heard, and in doing so, she left an intellectual legacy that would echo through the Renaissance and beyond. Now, with the quills of poets and the swords of warriors behind us, we'll turn toward the spiritual and political powerhouses who helped shape medieval belief and empire alike. Let's now step into the grand halls and political intrigues of 12th century Europe to meet one of the most formidable women in all of medieval history, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born in 1122, Eleanor inherited the vast and wealthy duchy of Aquitaine at just 15. She was immediately one of the most powerful heiresses in Europe, and the world took notice. That same year, she married King Louis VII of France and became queen. But Eleanor wasn't content to sit quietly at court. She accompanied Louis on the Second Crusade, leading troops and challenging the expectations of how a queen should behave. Her marriage to Louis eventually fell apart, in part because of their conflicting personalities. She was bold and politically savvy, while he was deeply pious and passive. Their union was annulled, and in 1152, just 2 months later, she married the young Henry Plantagenet, soon to become King Henry II of England. As Queen of England, Eleanor wielded enormous influence. She governed lands spanning from Scotland to the Pyrenees. She raised 8 children, including 2 future kings, Richard the Lionheart and John. She orchestrated alliances, advised her sons, and even led a rebellion against Henry when their relationship soured. For years, he kept her imprisoned in his castles, but after his death, Eleanor re-emerged as a political force, helping to secure Richard's reign and even negotiating with Saladin's representatives during the Crusades. Eleanor lived into her 80s, extraordinary for the time, and died as she lived, a ruler, a strategist, and a woman entirely her own. From courts and crusades, we now move to the windswept highlands of Scotland to meet a woman who was not born into royalty, but into sainthood, St. Margaret of Scotland. Margaret was born around 1045 in Hungary during her family's exile from England. Eventually they returned, but after the Norman conquest, Margaret and her family fled once again, this time to Scotland. There she married King Malcolm III and became Queen of Scots. Margaret brought with her not only noble blood, but deep religious conviction and a heart for reform. She helped align the Scottish Church more closely with Roman practices, improved education for the clergy, and established charitable institutions for the poor. She was known for her humility, fasting, and dedication to prayer, even while raising 8 children. She died in 1093, just days after learning of her husband's death in battle. Canonized as a saint in 1250, Margaret became the spiritual mother of a nation and one of the most beloved royal figures in Scottish history. Now let's head to the Iberian Peninsula, where another queen redefined power and piety. Isabella of Castile. Born in 1451, Isabella is most often remembered for funding Columbus's voyage to the Americas. But before that, she fought a different kind of battle, one for her throne. After years of political maneuvering and civil war, she secured her right to rule Castile and married Ferdinand of Aragon. Together, they united much of what would become modern Spain. Isabella was deeply devout and saw her rule as ordained by God. She reformed the church, strengthened the monarchy, and completed the Reconquista, the campaign to reclaim Spanish territory from Muslim rule by capturing Granada in 1492. But her reign was not without controversy. She established the Spanish Inquisition, a brutal campaign to enforce Catholic orthodoxy. Jews and Muslims were forced to convert, leave, or face persecution. Isabella was both visionary and ruthless. Her policies shaped the Spanish Empire for centuries to come. She died in 1504, leaving behind a legacy that remains debated to this day. Part saint, part sovereign, part symbol of imperial ambition. From monarchs and military strategy, we now descend into the realm of mysticism to meet a woman whose quiet revelations shook the theological world, Julian of Norwich. Julian was an anchoress, a religious recluse, who lived in a small cell attached to a church in Norwich, England, during the late 14th century. Very little is known about her life. We don't even know her real name. Julian comes from the name of the church where she lived, but what we do know is this. In 1373, during a severe illness, she experienced a series of powerful visions of Christ. After recovering, she devoted the rest of her life to meditating on their meaning. She recorded these visions in a book titled Revelations of Divine Love, the first known book written in English by a woman. What made Julian so remarkable wasn't just that she wrote, but what she wrote. Her theology was radically hopeful. She described God as both father and mother. She insisted that divine love was endless, patient, and gentle. In a time of plague, war, and apocalyptic dread, Julian famously wrote, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." These words, penned from a tiny room by an unnamed woman, offered comfort and courage to generations. Her work quietly survived, copied, hidden, protected, and today she is celebrated as one of the great spiritual voices of the medieval world. Through queens and saints, poets and prophets, we begin to see a pattern. These women, each in her own way, claimed a voice in a world that tried to silence them. Whether by crown or quill, by sword or vision, they carved out space where none had been granted, and their words, deeds, and dreams continue to shape our own. We now find ourselves in 14th century Italy, in the bustling city of Siena, where a young woman named Catherine would rise from obscurity to become a spiritual force of extraordinary influence, Saint Catherine of Siena. Born in 1347 to a large family, Catherine was deeply devout from childhood. She experienced visions of Christ and chose a life of religious devotion, though she never officially entered a convent. Instead, she became a lay member of the Dominican order and lived in service, caring for the sick, feeding the poor, and praying for hours each day. But Catherine wasn't content to remain in silent contemplation. She began to write letters, hundreds of them, to kings, queens, bishops, and even the Pope. Her words were passionate, urgent, and filled with divine conviction. She called for reform in the church, peace among warring Italian states, and a return to spiritual integrity. During a time when the papacy had moved to Avignon, France, Catherine travelled there herself to urge Pope Gregory V to return to Rome. And he did. She dictated her thoughts to scribes, producing one of the great spiritual texts of the Middle Ages, the Dialogue of Divine Providence. Her influence grew so great that she was eventually declared a Doctor of the Church, one of the very few women to ever receive that honour. Catherine died young, at 33, worn down by years of fasting and tireless labour. But in her brief life she had spoken louder than many ever dared to whisper. Next we ride into 15th century France, where a teenage girl would hear voices that changed history. Joan of Arc. Born in 1412 in Domremy, a small village, Joan claimed that saints spoke to her, urging her to support Charles VII and drive the English from France during the 100 Years' War. At just 17, she persuaded the Dauphin to give her troops and rode into battle dressed in armour. Her leadership, courage, and fierce belief inspired French forces. She helped lift the siege of Orléans and played a crucial role in Charles's coronation at Reims. But her victories made her enemies. Captured by Burgundian forces, she was handed over to the English and put on trial for heresy and witchcraft. She was just 19 when she was burned at the stake in 1431. 2 decades later, the church reversed its decision, declaring her innocent. Centuries later, she was canonized a saint. Joan remains one of the most iconic figures in world history, a peasant girl who defied kings, led armies, and died for a vision she never abandoned. And now, from the battlefield to the page, we meet a woman whose life was defined not by swords or sainthood, but by storytelling, Margery Kempe. Born around 1373 in Norfolk, England, Margery lived a life full of contradiction. She was a mother to 14 children and a merchant's wife, yet she also claimed mystical visions, bouts of religious ecstasy, and a calling to a deeply spiritual life. After a traumatic experience in childbirth, Margery devoted herself to Christ, so passionately that her public displays of devotion drew attention and, at times, scorn. She wept openly in church, interrupted sermons, and preached without permission. She went on pilgrimages across Europe and the Holy Land, often provoking controversy wherever she travelled. But Margery's most lasting contribution came through her voice. Specifically, her book. Unable to read or write, she dictated her story to a scribe. The Book of Margery Kempe is widely considered the first autobiography in the English language. In it, she chronicles her spiritual struggles, her travels, her clashes with clergy and neighbours, and her deeply personal relationship with God. Her book offers a rare, raw, and intimate glimpse into the inner world of a medieval woman. It wasn't polished or idealized, it was human. Margery was mocked in her lifetime. Some called her mad, others feared her, but her words endured. And today she is celebrated not just as a mystic, but as a pioneer of self-expression. Now let's travel east to the court of Bohemia in England, where diplomacy, literacy, and quiet influence changed the course of culture. Anne of Bohemia. Born in 1366, Anne was the daughter of Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor. At 16, she married King Richard II of England in what was meant to be a purely political alliance. Her arrival in England was met with skepticism. She brought no large dowry, no military advantage. Many considered her an unnecessary foreign bride, but Anne quickly proved herself to be far more than a ceremonial queen. She was kind, intelligent, and deeply committed to education and religious reform. She spoke multiple languages and surrounded herself with scholars. She helped popularize the works of John Wycliffe, a theologian whose push to translate the Bible into English challenged church orthodoxy and laid early groundwork for the Reformation. Anne also promoted literacy among noblewomen, encouraging them to read religious texts in their native tongues. Through her example, she reshaped the role of queen, not as silent consort but as cultural bridge. When she died in 1394 at just 28, Richard II was devastated. He ordered extravagant memorials and went into deep mourning. Though her life was short, Anne's legacy, especially in literature and reform, echoed long after her passing. Through Catherine's letters, Joan's sword, Margery's voice, and Anne's diplomacy, we see yet another dimension of feminine power in the medieval world. None of these women fit neatly into their assigned roles. None obeyed quietly, and all, in their own ways, rewrote the boundaries of who women could be. And still, there are more voices to hear. Now we journey to the Caucasus Mountains to the medieval kingdom of Georgia, where a woman ruled not merely as consort or caretaker, but as sovereign in her own right. Her name was Queen Tamar. Born in 1160, Tamar was the daughter of King George III of Georgia. When her father died, she became the first woman to rule Georgia as its sole monarch. Her reign from 1184 to 1213 is often considered the golden age of Georgian history. But Tamar's path to power was anything but easy. At first, nobles tried to control her rule by appointing male co-rulers and attempting to undermine her authority. She responded not with open rebellion, but with political brilliance, gradually asserting control, building loyal alliances, and proving her strength through action. She led military campaigns that expanded Georgia's territory and secured its borders. Under her leadership, Georgian art, architecture, and literature flourished. The poet Shota Rustaveli wrote The Knight in the Panther's Skin, during her reign, a literary masterpiece dedicated to her. Tamar's court became a center of culture and scholarship. She was admired for her wisdom, piety, and resolve. Though she never took the title king, she ruled as one, and more. When she died in 1213, she left behind a powerful and unified kingdom, remembered not as a woman who ruled in spite of her gender, but as a monarch who transcended it. From the mountains of Georgia, we return to the courts of Western Europe to meet a queen whose diplomatic instincts and cultural influence changed the face of England, Eleanor of Provence. Born around 1223 in what is now southern France, Eleanor married King Henry III of England at the age of 12. She was highly educated, refined, and politically astute. But her early years in England were marked by tension. Her French relatives, whom Henry invited to court, were resented by the English nobility. Eleanor herself was viewed with suspicion, and at times outright hostility. Still, she persisted. She supported Henry through political crises, including the Second Barons' War. After his capture during the conflict, Eleanor raised funds, gathered troops, and helped secure his release. She was fiercely loyal, not just as a wife but as a partner in rule. Eleanor also brought with her a taste for continental fashion, poetry, and chivalric culture. She patronized troubadours, poets, and artists, helping to weave French literary traditions into English court life. Though often overshadowed by more flamboyant monarchs, Eleanor of Provence was a cultural and political bridge between two worlds, and a quietly powerful queen who helped stabilize a turbulent kingdom. Let us now shift from palaces to abbeys, from political strategy to spiritual devotion, and meet a woman revered as both saint and founder, Bridget of Kildare. Though much of her story blends myth and history, Bridget is believed to have lived in the 5th century and played a foundational role in early Irish Christianity. According to tradition, she was born into slavery, the daughter of a pagan chieftain and a Christian mother. From a young age, she was known for her generosity, often giving away her family's possessions to help the poor. Bridget eventually took religious vows and founded a monastery at Kildare, one of the first double monasteries in Ireland, housing both monks and nuns. She became an abbess and spiritual leader, respected for her wisdom, compassion, and miracles attributed to her name. Legends tell of her turning water into beer, healing the sick, and even hanging her cloak on a sunbeam. But, beyond folklore, Bridget's real legacy lies in her role as a symbol of mercy and strength. She is one of Ireland's patron saints, alongside Patrick and Columba. Her feast day, February 1st, continues to be celebrated in Ireland and beyond, bridging the pre-Christian traditions of Imbolc with the Christian calendar. Now we turn to the High Middle Ages, to a queen who steered a kingdom during one of its most turbulent periods, Blanche of Castile. Born in 1188 in Spain, Blanche was the granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine and daughter of King Alfonso VIII of Castile. She married Louis of France and became queen consort, but her greatest influence came after his death, when she served as regent for their young son, Louis IX, later canonized as Saint Louis. As regent, Blanche managed the realm with remarkable skill. She negotiated peace treaties, suppressed rebellions, and maintained authority over fractious nobles who sought to take advantage of the king's youth. But Blanche wasn't only a guardian of power, she was a shaper of character. She was instrumental in forming Louis IX's religious and moral worldview, guiding him with firm discipline and deep piety. Her influence is often credited with shaping one of the most devout and effective monarchs in French history. Even after Louis came of age, he continued to rely on her counsel. Blanche remained politically active until her death in 1252, a queen mother whose legacy extended far beyond bloodline. From the stone halls of England to the cloisters of Kildare, from the golden courts of Georgia to the shifting alliances of France, these women remind us that power wears many forms. It can be quiet, like a letter passed in secret. It can be grand, like a coronation in a marble cathedral. It can be political, cultural, spiritual, or all at once. And in the hands of these women, it reshaped the world. 0701.3 fair. Now let us move into the mountainous heart of northern Italy, where one of the most formidable political and military minds of the 11th century held her ground, Countess Matilda of Tuscany. Born in 1046 into a powerful noble family, Matilda inherited vast territories across Italy and became a key player in the investiture controversy, a fierce political struggle between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope over who had the right to appoint bishops. Matilda was a staunch supporter of the papacy. She led armies, fortified cities, and played host to Pope Gregory VII during his infamous confrontation with Emperor Henry IV. It was on her land, at her castle in Canossa, that the emperor stood barefoot in the snow in 1077, pleading for forgiveness, a moment that symbolized a rare reversal of secular and spiritual power. Matilda ruled for decades, commanding loyalty from soldiers and clergy alike. She never married for alliance alone and maintained full control over her lands and decisions. When she died in 1115, her political savvy and unwavering conviction had helped shift the balance of European power. Next, we meet a woman whose legacy has been debated for centuries, Isabella of France, often called the She-Wolf of France. Born in 1295, Isabella was the daughter of King Philip IV of France and became Queen of England through her marriage to Edward II. Their union was turbulent. Edward's favouritism towards certain male courtiers, especially Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, caused scandal and political unrest. Isabella, politically astute and fiercely determined, eventually allied with exiled nobles and raised an army, alongside her lover, Roger Mortimer, to depose her husband. They succeeded. Edward II was captured, forced to abdicate in favour of their son, and later died under mysterious circumstances. For several years, Isabella and Mortimer ruled England as regents for the young Edward III, but as their power grew, so did resentment. Eventually, Edward III came of age, seized control, and had Mortimer executed. Isabella was spared, but spent the rest of her life largely in retirement. To some, she was a power-hungry traitor. To others, a woman who took control when no one else would. Either way, her actions reshaped English monarchy, and the debate around her never truly ended. Now we step into a softer yet no less powerful kind of legacy, that of Elizabeth of Hungary. Born in 1207 into royal privilege, Elizabeth was married at 14 to a German landgrave. Despite her youth and status, she lived a life of extraordinary compassion. Deeply influenced by the teachings of St. Francis of Assisi, she gave generously to the poor, built hospitals, and even gave up her jewelry and fine clothes. When her husband died during the Crusades, Elizabeth refused to remarry. Instead, she embraced a life of religious devotion, founding a hospital and caring for the sick with her own hands. She died at just 24, but her short life left a lasting impression. Canonized just 4 years after her death, she became a symbol of Christian charity and humility, beloved across Europe. Her image often appears with bread or a jug of water, always serving, always gentle. And now we end our journey with a woman whose name is far less known, but whose brilliance shone quietly through the cracks of time, Juliana Morel. Born in 1594 in Spain, technically just outside the medieval period, but within its long shadow, Juliana was a child prodigy. She mastered Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and several sciences before she was 10. By 12, she was publicly defending philosophical theses in front of university scholars. She later took religious vows, becoming a Dominican nun, and continued her studies in law, theology, and music. She is often credited as the first woman to earn a university degree. Though historians debate the technicalities, Juliana lived much of her life in cloistered study and contemplation. She didn't lead armies or advise kings, but in her quiet intellect and relentless pursuit of knowledge, she opened a door. She proved that women's minds were as sharp, as vast, and as worthy as any man's. And that brings us to the end of our journey. Not to the end of these women's impact, but to a place of stillness where we can reflect. Across 6 centuries and countless borders, we've heard the voices of empresses, abbesses, poets, prophets, warriors, and queens. Some were canonized, others condemned. Some ruled empires, others ruled only their own hearts, but all of them pushed against the boundaries of what women were allowed to be. They refused to be small, refused to be silent, refused to fit neatly into the roles prescribed for them by church, state, or sword, and in doing so, they left behind more than names in dusty manuscripts or fading church frescoes. They left examples of courage, intelligence, compassion, and power. Their stories remind us that history is not just made in war rooms and thrones, but also in convents, in kitchens, in letters, in prayers, in poems, and in quiet acts of resistance. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, think of them, not as distant figures from another world, but as women who, in many ways, lived the same questions we do now. What does it mean to love well? To speak truth? To lead with kindness? To be heard? Their answers echo across time, not always in shouts, but in whispers. And now, with those whispers still lingering in the air, I bid you good night.